Welcome to Season 2 of the Morning Glory Project. I'm your host, Betsy Graziani-Fassbender. And on this podcast, I bring to you guests of a lot of different kinds, survivors and thrivers, innovators and trailblazers, folks that have fallen down and gotten back up, folks that have been knocked down and gotten back up. Basically, I ask every single guest the same question. How did you get through what you got through? And the reason I ask that is because I think that when we share those stories, we gain empathy for those different than ourselves. We gain understanding from those whose circumstances may resemble our own. But we all get to walk away with a little notion of how we might get through whatever we're going through. I hope you enjoyed these stories and feel free to go to themorninggloryproject.com to find any past episodes or to listen to one again, and feel free to share us out with your friends and give us a review or a like. We sure do appreciate it. Thanks for listening. It's my pleasure today to welcome to the Morning Glory Project Barbara Abercrombie. When Barbara's husband died, she found the language of condolence, no matter how well-intended, often not only unhelpful, but sometimes downright irritating. In her grief, she yearned for words that acknowledged the reality of what it felt like to survive a loved one's death, and that could unflinchingly speak to the sorrow and loneliness, and sometimes even guilt and anger that can show up in the mourning process. When she searched for a book that might help, they were all either too clinical or too flowery. She ultimately created the book that she needed. Finding that ordinary language wouldn't do, she discovered that it was poetry that cut to the chase. Her book, The Language of Loss, Poetry and Prose for Grieving and Celebrating the Love of Your Life, is Barbara's 16th book. It's a collection of reflections on grief from many of the world's best and most diverse writers and poets, from Patti Smith to Rumi, from Joan Didion to Mary Oliver. It's a book that shares both the abject anguish of loss and the glimmers of hope and possibility that can be born of it. Barbara is an award-winning writer, writing instructor at the UCLA Extension. She lives in Southern California with her rescue dogs, Nina and Nelson, who might just make their opinions known during this chat. So, Barbara, welcome to the Morning Glory Project. I'm so glad you're here today.
Thank you, Betsy. Thanks so much for inviting me.
So, Barbara, tell me about before February 2015. Tell me what your life was like with your husband.
Well, there were two parts of it, actually. I had a wonderful life with my husband. It was a second marriage, and I had known him for a long time. He was one of my best male friends. And when we both went through divorces, and we went through them separately, we didn't cause each other's divorce, but we got together after our divorces. And we had learned a lot from failed marriages, and we had a wonderful marriage, and we had a wonderful, I like to think, almost perfect blended family. And he was involved in his work, and I worked, and I thought, oh, I have a perfect life now. And then he had a lot of health issues, but the last year of his life, he was very ill, and that's when the perfect life started to fall apart, as all perfect lives do, I think, at some point or another.
So he became quite ill, I'm gathering. What was the nature of his illness?
He was diagnosed with throat cancer in February 2014, and he went through treatment, and the treatment was really worse than the disease. He could no longer, he had a stomach tube. He could no longer eat or drink. And then he recovered. He recovered from the cancer. But by then it was a downward spiral. He had like 12 doctors and was on 20 medications, and he had to have back surgery, and one thing led to another, and he got sicker and sicker, and he died February 10th.
So virtually a year after he was diagnosed with the cancer.
Yeah. And I'm writing a memoir about that. It's called The Year Before, about what we went through.
Well, and it seems that, so many times that end of life period of time can offer us just a mixed bag of experiences, both poignant and loving, and also so exhausting and maddening and sorrow filled.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And the perfect blended family also created issues that I had no idea of. So it became very complicated on many levels.
How so?
With stepchildren, and I had, you read obituaries, and so died at home, surrounded by his loving family, and a blended family can be very, very difficult, especially with grown children, with middle-aged children we had, and it was it was it was emotional on a lot of different levels because I was being second guessed. But and it got very, let's use the word complicated. That's
complicated. Yeah. Well, and of course, I'm not asking you to share details that belong to other people, but I guess what I mean is that added to the difficulty, that rather than sort of being that quote perfect blended family that you thought you had, the fissures and challenges and difficulties emerged.
They did, and all the longtime resentments and siblings. The siblings themselves were fighting and getting angry at each other, and it became very dramatic. And I found myself envying people who went through grief in a very pure way. Mm-hmm. Without the underpinnings of drama and mm-hmm. backstabbing, actually, you could call it.
Well, it's funny. For a long time, Barbara, I've used a term that I think I made up. I don't think I stole it. There's a myriad different kinds of grief, of course, but I have a kind of grief that I like to call simple grief.
Yes.
Which is just, I think of my grandfather passed away, for example. He was 97 years old. He was much beloved. He had no enemies, no unfinished business. He led a simple, kind, decent life, right? And when he passed, we were sad that we would miss him, but that was the simplest grief, right? He lived independently until his last days. There was just nothing to grieve but that he wasn't with us anymore. That's sort of like, I hold that up as my kind of gold standard of simple grief.
Yes.
Right? And it gets, here's a technical term, it gets crappier from that down. Right? Right. That when there's either a long-standing illness and you have mixed feelings about somebody parting, or because you're also, I'm guessing, relieved because they're out of anguish, and you're probably exhausted. Yes. When there is contention, when there's an unresolved issues that are left behind by the person or between you and their loved ones, all of that, it gets more and more complicated. It's no longer that simple grief experience.
Exactly.
That's frankly quite rare.
Oh, how wonderful your grandfather had such a beautiful death. I mean, that's how we all want to go.
Yeah, so I can understand you being jealous about that a little bit.
And also, it was what was complicated in my case, in my husband's case, was that he was on so many medications, and he was deeply depressed and angry, and I was the nearest target. And so it was back and forth, and we rarely ever fought. We never bickered. We'd gotten through with all that stuff in our first marriages. So we were suddenly in this very difficult marriage. And then when he did die, and there's the fight, the fight at the end of, should he die at home? Should he die in a nursing home? And his kids were saying, "Oh, he's got to go to the nursing home because he's going to get well and he'll do exercises." And it was crazy. And then there's the stuff afterward. I'm reading a wonderful novel, Anne Patchett's The Dutch House, about a house that's left. And I'm thinking, oh my God, that's my story, in reverse. But, and very often widows or widowers have to leave where they've spent all their time with their house. They give up, they leave their house. Right. So it's a difficult time.
Well, and I haven't done any research on this, but I'm guessing that my ideals of that simple grief, that kind of experience is in the minority, that more often when we lose somebody, particularly somebody close to us, in addition to whatever sorrow we might have in their leaving, there are usually some other complications, either something that we said or wish we hadn't or didn't say and wish we had, something unresolved, all of that. And it's always been funny to me or peculiar to me that, or it used to be, and it seems clearer now, that when somebody loses, and I'm not saying that this is your relationship with your husband, of course, but when somebody loses somebody from whom they are either estranged or hostile or any of those kinds of things, that their grief is harder. And it always seemed like, gosh, why would that be harder for you when, rather than losing somebody that you're deeply love? And it comes back to that notion of simplicity, that just, it's a simple sorrow and it's not tangled up with a bunch of other mess.
Exactly. And that's what I do want to write a book about. I am writing the memoir, and I'm the message is let each other know how you want to die. Really discuss it, and don't deny the fact that one of you is going to die, and plan for it. And I'm in a space now where I talk at great length to my daughters, or one of my daughters. One daughter doesn't want to hear about this; she just doesn't want to talk about the possibility. And the other daughter is wonderful. She, I can tell her everything the way I want things, and we're hoping it's not for a while, many years yet, but I feel it's a good feeling too, to know that someone has all your wishes and will carry them out.
Well, there's an organization called Reimagine End of Life.
Oh, really?
And in fact, I've had two guests on the Morning Glory Project who've spoken about it. And it's exactly this. You may want to check them out. It's an organization that helps people talk candidly about death before, during, and after the process, and helps to prepare them and all of that. And it sounds like that's what you were craving too. But you, because you're a word person, a writer, you've written and read and taught writing and all of that, you craved words.
I did.
That brought you comfort. And what did you find?
What did I find?
From the flowery to the clinical, I think
found,
is what we said.
Or self-help. And I would, self-help made me angry. I didn't want steps or stages. I wanted company. And the way I have found company all my life is by reading.
Wait, I want to linger there for a second. I didn't want self-help.
Yeah.
I didn't want steps. I wanted company. And for you, words, poetry, stories, that was your company?
Yes. I wanted people who could articulate what they had gone through and how difficult it was and how crazy they were. And it's crazy. A priest told me at my husband's memorial before it, he said, you're going to be crazy and fragile for a year. And then you're still going to be crazy and fragile, but not as much so. That was the most helpful thing anybody had ever said to me, because that's exactly how I felt, crazy and fragile. And it was normal.
Well, it sounds like it made you feel less crazy and less fragile to hear that.
Exactly.
Ironically.
Exactly. And when I read, so I wanted to read poets, and in the beginning I couldn't concentrate. You're a therapist, that after a trauma, your concentration goes. And I couldn't keep track of stories, or I couldn't read a book or even the newspaper in the beginning, but I could read brief poems, pieces of poems. And I would read them over and over. And after about, I guess it was after a year, I thought, there is a book in this. There's a book about losing the love of your life, your spouse, your partner. And there is one wonderful book by edited by Kevin Young, called The Art of Losing. And it's beautiful poetry about grief, but it's all kinds of grief. And though it's terribly hard to lose your parents, and I've gone through that, it's a grief that you expect. It hurts terribly, but you have your own life to go back to afterward. And when you lose your partner, he or she is your life, and you have to, the bottom of your life falls out, and then you have to rebuild another life. So I couldn't find in his book, there were very few poems about partners. It was all about parents and friends dying, and I needed I wanted company.
Well, I'm thinking, Barbara, as you're talking about how, we tend, I think, I mean, first of all, at least in Western culture, American culture, which is the only one I'm most familiar with, of course, we don't tend to want to talk about this stuff anyway.
Yeah, right.
But when we do, we tend to speak about it in generalities,
yes,
right?
Yes.
So there are these general books about grief, and God bless, Kubler-Ross for coming up with stages so we could kind of put some language to it and all of that. But it sounds like what you were craving is what so many of us crave when we're in anguish or confusion, is that you were craving some specific understanding,
yes,
for your circumstances. So it sounds like the language of loss that you've done, you've assembled poetry and prose that speaks specifically to partner loss.
Yes, but I've been that's exactly what I intended it for. But I'm finding a number of people who have read it or given it to friends, and it's also like a gift book. It's what you give to a friend if you don't, when you don't know what to say. But a lot of people have said it's just helped them through all kinds of grief, and heaven knows we're going through national grief right now.
Well, maybe the specific can be generalized, but the generalized, it's hard to make it specific.
Oh, that's wonderful. I'm going to write that down.
Does that feel true?
Yeah. Yeah.
So, Barbara, tell me, I'm a writer, but I've dabbled in some poetry, but I'm not a poet by nature. But I've always admired poets. I've often said that, they can sometimes say in 17 syllables what it takes me 350 pages to figure out.
Yes.
So you're saying that poetry cut and these short bits of prose kind of cut to the chase.
Right.
In other words, are you saying that they really cut out the extraneous stuff and just went right to the heart of what you were feeling?
The narrative, the what happened and why, and the whole story of it, it went right to the heart, right to the feelings. As a matter of fact, I teach memoir at UCLA, and I gave my students a homework assignment this week saying, go find a stuck place in your memoir and turn it into poetry. You don't have to write you don't have to tell us anything. You don't have to explain anything. You don't have to show us anything. Turn it into a poem. So I'm quite eager to find out what they're going to be turning in next week. But yeah, it's like a shot. I don't know. Poetry was like a shot of adrenaline to me, and there was there were some poems I'd read and I'd weep, but I needed to weep. When you're grieving, you need to weep. You don't need to get over it or, come to, what's the word everybody always uses? Closure. The closure. And I'll tell. Can I tell you an anecdote about closure?
Of course.
My daughter's grief makes other people very nervous. It's very hard to be around people. You have to just. And my daughters thought I should go to a grief group, and this was about 4 months into it. Bob had been dead for 4 months, and finally I said, "Okay, I'll go to a grief group." And I had the intake. I met a counselor for an intake, and she was asking me questions. And she said, "Do you ever feel that you can't go on?" And I said, "Yeah." I said, "I do. I have felt that way. I felt, what's the point of going on living? This is so painful." And I said, but then I realized I would have to kill my dog. And I thought, what kind of a person would kill her dog? And that struck me as so funny. I realized I was no longer suicidal. But,
isn't it funny how sometimes those macabre moments
exactly
cut through our grief and get to the funny bones somehow?
Dark humor of that. Yes, I would have to murder them.
Oh, I know this feeling.
Yes.
I know that. It's funny. I've often thought that, when people say that you need to get over something, I thought, well, it's just the wrong preposition, right? I mean, it's not get over, it's get
Through it,
through
yeah.
it, live with it.
You have to walk through it. And I found grief, I grieved for 2 years. I mean, that's what I did. I got through it by every morning I got up and did yoga for 20 minutes because that's what I've been doing for the past 40 or 50 years. I get up and I do yoga and I don't think about it. It's an absolute habit. And then I would take my dog out and we would walk for miles and miles. And then I would invite my friends over for potlucks. I'd say, I can't cook, but I would love it if you'd bring food and we'll all have a wonderful dinner together. And I did that a lot. And then I went back to work teaching 2 months after. And I had no concentration for it, but I kept meticulous notes about what I was going to say and what my students said. And I got through it. And I realized I could only be alone in the house for so long. So sometimes I'd just get in the car and drive. And I had a hard time writing alone in the house in the very beginning. So I would go to one of my daughters and sit at her kitchen table. It was a daughter who had a lot of dogs and little kids. And that's how I started writing when my children were little, and I'd sit in a kitchen and I'd write, and there were dogs and little children.
Isn't it funny that most of us would think, oh, to write, you need to go off by yourself, but it sounds like it was too cavernous. The emptiness was too big.
Yeah, exactly.
You needed the noise and the distraction to kind of, but it's sometimes, doesn't it seem like sometimes you have to have something to rub against?
That is so true. That is so true, Betsy. That's a wonderful, because when I had little kids and I was juggling my life and, my writing time was so precious. And then when they grew up and I went through a divorce and had all the time in the world, there's such a thing as having too much time. And I had too much time to write, and I had to refigure out how do I do it? What do I do without rubbing against the
limitations?
The limitations, exactly. Yeah.
Huh. Well, Barbara, I understand you have a short bit of prose that you can read for us today that was sort of emblematic of your experience. Would you be willing to read that for us?
I will, and I also want to say the book is an arc. There's 3 sections, and the first section is really abject grief. It's called Sweeping Up the Heart. And then the second section is called Going On After, and it's when you grit your teeth and you just get through it. You just get up every morning and do what you have to do. And then the third section is called Turning, and it's a line from Patti Smith, who I adore. Mm-hmm. And it's when your life starts to turn and you're no longer grieving. You're missing. You will always miss the person who's died. You will just always miss them and want to tell them things. But it's very different than grieving. Mm-hmm. Okay, this is by Julian Barnes, who is a British writer, a novelist and essayist, and I adore him. This is from an essay called From Levels of Life. I did already know that only the old words would do. Death, grief, sorrow, sadness, heartbreak. Nothing modernly evasive or medicalizing. Grief is a human, not a medical condition, and while there are pills to help us forget it and everything else, there are no pills to cure it. The grief-struck are not depressed, just properly, appropriately, mathematically, quote marks, it hurts exactly as much as it is worth, sad. One euphemistic verb I especially loathed was pass. I'm sorry to hear your wife has passed, as in passed water, passed blood. You do not have to force the word die on others, even if you always use it yourself. There is a midpoint. At a social event she and I would normally have attended together, an acquaintance came up and said to me simply, "There's someone missing." That felt correct in both senses.
Well, it sounds like what you did is that you sort of recreated architecture of your life after you got through that sort of acute anguish period, mm-hmm. that you added in the normal stuff, that you pieced it together. You you kept up with some of your normal rituals, like the yoga, which I'm sure was sustaining.
Yes, yes.
But then you added some new things, the potlucks with friends, that you reached out.
I did, and I there was one point, and specifically there were potlucks with just family and friends, and then at one point I thought we had a big house, and it was very big and very empty, and I thought I want to fill this with life. There's been too much sadness in it the past year, so I invited all my writer friends and my students to come to we called it the Lit Salon. And I said, bring something to read. You can read whatever you're working on, read for 5 minutes, and then bring something to eat and something to drink. And it worked out so well. I think it was the smartest thing I did after Bob died, because it grew to about 30, 35 people, bottles of wine, wonderful food to eat. And then I limited it to 10 people who would read for 5 minutes each. And they all fell in love with each other's writing and each other. And it was just an incredibly loving group. And then after I moved out of the house, I had a temporary small apartment, a very tiny apartment. And I thought, well, this is where I live. I'm going to invite all those 35 people. And they all came, brought the wine, brought the food, and they all said, oh, it's so much cozier here. And it worked. And then this was in Los Angeles, and I'm now in Pasadena, and I have another house, and we're still doing it. Not during the pandemic, but we've done it. It went on for 3 years, and I hope as soon as this pandemic is over, we'll start up again. But it was really, and I'm sort of amazed at myself, because it was such a smart thing to do. And didn't think I was doing smart things at the time.
Well, there's smart from the head and there's smart from the instinct. And it sounds like your instinct was that I'll be audacious here. You can correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds as though you built another family, really, in some ways.
You're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. Yes.
And a family that could nurture. They didn't replace your loved ones, of course, but they could give you what you needed. I call it's like family of choice as opposed to family by DNA, right? Family by design.
Yeah. And I'll tell you a secret. That's how I feel about my students, too. Mm-hmm. They are my family. And, and I feel one of the blessings of my life is having work that I absolutely adore, teaching and writing. I mean, I think if it's so important, for whether it's volunteer work or whatever it is, but finding something that you feel passionate about. And I was able to turn work into, you're so right, a family, a community. It was a real community. And what so thrilled me was that they felt that they had found a community too. And writers are usually so isolated, and they just love having this Lit Salon community. It's their family.
Well, at a time in our culture when we don't have the sort of same sense of neighborhood and community very often, we don't, and certainly, our lives on freeways and those kinds of things don't typically connect us as deeply. It sounds like you created your own little town square.
I did, Betsy, and I so loved it. I still love it, and yes, and I'm teaching on Zoom now, but that feels like, they all come to my screen every Tuesday morning, and we all get together, and it's even more important now.
Well, that's a lesson we're all learning, is how to connect when we're apart.
Yeah.
And we have the blessing and sometimes the irritation of technology that lets us do that.
Right.
Barbara, I also want to thank you. A dear friend of mine recently lost a husband that she had been with for many, many years. And I can't tell you how comforting it was to be able to recommend a book that was specifically for her needs.
Oh.
And so I thank you on a personal level, and thank you so very much for being part of the Morning Glory Project. I so appreciate your time and your thoughtfulness and your good heart today.
Oh, Betsy, thank you. Thank you for all your wonderful questions. I've really enjoyed this a lot. Thank you.
Sometimes you have a conversation with somebody that just seems too doggone short. And that was the case for me with Barbara Abercrombie. I wanted to learn more about her story and to gather more information from how she got through the grief that she lived through. You know, I was really touched by one specific thing that she said, though, that I want to emphasize. And she talked about how in her grief, she didn't want platitudes. She didn't want specific words. She didn't want steps to go through or clinical information. What she wanted was company. And that, yes, eventually that meant people, where she had her potlucks and her students and her writing salon. But at first, for her, that company meant stories and poetry and words that she found comforting. I think we all want company, and some people, the company is just the company of themselves. They want some solitude for a while, and for others, they want to be surrounded by others. For some, it's exercise and nature, and for others, it's poetry. But what we all want is company in our grief, to be understood. I've used this quote before, but it's one that I sort of live by, from Sue Monk Kidd, who says, "There's no pain on earth that doesn't crave a benevolent witness." And it seemed that that's what Barbara talked about. I'll take that as my extra bloom today. Thanks so much for listening to the Morning Glory Project. I certainly appreciate your time, and I wish you every comfort and every bit of safety. And I hope that you, wherever you are, whomever you're with, whether it's just you or you have a whole crew of barking dogs and yelling kids, that you find your own way to bloom.